When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear of being caught. It was because he would see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he skillfully pulled it back and kept reading. I watched his face change as he read line by line, feeling my life crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew right now he would reach that message that would destroy my life. The one that would explain everything and put a period at the end. Or the opposite, confuse things even more. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from 6 feet away. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake, the mistake that changed absolutely everything forever, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really was. Before I share with you the secret I tried so carefully to hide for so long, write in the comments what city you're watching this video from, and also answer this question. Have you ever had a secret you tried to hide with all your might, but in the end you couldn't succeed? The elevator to the 46th floor had always been my sanctuary. 6 minutes of solitude before stepping into the controlled chaos of corporate America, where I was Laura Mitchell, Senior Vice President of Strategic Marketing, corner office, 6-figure salary, and 20 years of climbing the ladder one calculated step at a time. This morning felt different, though. The familiar hum of the elevator seemed louder, more insistent, like it was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. I checked my reflection in the polished steel doors. 47 years old, and I still looked good, better than good, actually. The expensive skincare routine was paying off, my auburn hair was perfectly styled, and my charcoal business suit fit like it was tailored just for me, which it was. From the outside, I had everything a woman my age could want. The perfect life, perfectly packaged. The doors opened with their usual soft chime, and I stepped into the hallway that led to my domain. Margaret, my assistant, was already at her desk with my coffee, 2 sugars, splash of cream, exactly how I'd been drinking it for the past decade. Everything was predictable, orderly, safe. That's how I liked it. That's how I needed it to be. Good morning, Laura. Jake will be here at 9 for orientation, Margaret said, not looking up from her computer screen. He seems very eager to start. Jake. My nephew. 26 years old, fresh out of business school with an MBA from Wharton, and somehow he'd landed an internship in my department. When my sister called asking for the favor, I couldn't say no. Family obligations, she'd said. He needs guidance from someone successful. The last time I'd seen Jake was 2 Christmases ago, a quiet kid picking at his turkey while the adults talked about mortgages and retirement plans. I settled into my office, spreading out the quarterly reports that needed my review before the 10 o'clock meeting. Numbers had always made sense to me. They didn't lie, didn't pretend, didn't leave room for interpretation. Unlike people. Unlike the growing emptiness in my marriage that David and I both pretended not to notice. Unlike the way I'd started questioning whether this corner office and company car were worth the 20 years I'd sacrificed to get them. At exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret knocked. Jake's here. The young man who walked into my office bore little resemblance to the awkward college student from family gatherings. He was tall, confident, wearing a crisp navy suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine but professional. When he sat across from my desk, I noticed he didn't fidget or look around nervously like most interns did. He looked directly at me, waiting. So, Jake, I began, falling into my practiced routine of intimidating new hires. What makes you think you can handle the pressure of working in strategic marketing? Honestly, Aunt Laura, I mean, Miss Mitchell, he corrected himself quickly, I don't know if I can. But I know I want to learn from the best, and everyone in business school talked about the campaign you ran for Morrison Industries. The one that increased their market share by 30% in 6 months. He'd done his homework. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine professional curiosity about someone else's potential. Most interns came in expecting to fetch coffee and make copies. Jake was looking at me like he actually wanted to understand how I thought, how I worked, how I'd built my reputation. The Morrison campaign was 5 years ago, I said, testing him. The principles haven't changed. Consumer psychology, market positioning, timing, those fundamentals are timeless. But the delivery methods evolve constantly. That's what makes it interesting, isn't it? The balance between proven strategy and innovation. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, not just the confidence, but the intelligence behind it. This wasn't the boy who used to hide behind his mother at family barbecues. This was a man who'd clearly spent the last few years learning how to command attention and respect. Tell me about the Henley account, I said, referring to our most challenging client. For the next 30 minutes, Jake analyzed their current marketing strategy with a precision that impressed me. He'd clearly studied our client list, understood their challenges, and had ideas, actual, implementable ideas, for improvement. When he suggested a complete rebranding approach that I'd been considering but hadn't fully developed, I felt something shift inside me. It was professional admiration, I told myself. Nothing more. But as I watched him leave my office, walking with that easy confidence toward his assigned cubicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that my perfectly ordered world had just developed its first crack. And the strangest part was, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to repair it. 3 weeks into Jake's internship, I found myself staying late more often than I had in years. Not because the workload had increased, but because something about our afternoon strategy sessions had become the highlight of my day. Jake had a way of looking at problems that challenged everything I thought I knew about marketing. More importantly, he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like more than just a boss, more than just someone's aunt, more than just David's wife who happened to have a successful career. Tonight, we were alone on the 46th floor. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until 10, and most of my colleagues had left hours ago for their suburban dinners and soccer practices. The city sparkled below us through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I was acutely aware of how different this felt from my usual solitary evening routine of reviewing reports until David came home from whatever client dinner or business meeting kept him occupied these days. What if we approached the Henley rebrand from an emotional angle instead of a logical one? Jake asked, leaning over the conference table where we'd spread out mock-ups and market research. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened, and there was an energy about him that reminded me of how I used to feel about work before it became just another series of obligations to fulfill. Emotions don't drive B2B purchasing decisions, I replied automatically, though even as I said it, I realized I wasn't entirely convinced. Don't they? He moved around the table to stand beside me, pointing at the demographic data. These are people making decisions, not machines. They have mortgages, kids in college, retirement plans they're worried about. When they choose a vendor, they're not just buying a product, they're buying peace of mind. I could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made me realize I couldn't remember the last time I'd noticed how a man smelled. David had worn the same aftershave for 15 years. I'd stopped registering it long ago, the same way I'd stopped registering most things about him. You're suggesting we sell security instead of services, I said, trying to focus on the proposal and not on how close Jake was standing. I'm suggesting we sell the feeling of having made the right choice. When he looked at me then, something passed between us that had nothing to do with marketing strategies or client presentations. It was recognition, I think. The acknowledgement that we were both pretending this was just work when it had become something else entirely. Something I didn't have a name for and wasn't sure I wanted to examine too closely. I started to say, then stopped because what I wanted to say was brilliant but what I should say was interesting and what I ended up saying was nothing at all because Jake was looking at me like I was the most fascinating woman he'd ever met, and I couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at me that way. That's what, he asked softly. The smart thing would have been to step back, to create some professional distance, to remind both of us that I was his supervisor and his aunt and a married woman who had no business standing this close to her nephew while her heart pounded like she was 25 again. Instead, I found myself moving closer. That's exactly what they need to hear, I whispered. Later, I would try to remember who moved first. Whether it was him leaning down or me rising up on my toes or if we somehow met in the middle of that space between professional and personal, between appropriate and absolutely insane. All I knew was that one moment we were discussing emotional marketing strategies and the next moment we kissed. It wasn't a long kiss. It wasn't passionate or desperate or any of the things I might have expected if I'd ever allowed myself to imagine such a moment, which I absolutely had not. It was soft and questioning and over almost before it began. But it was also the first time in years that I'd felt anything other than numb. We broke apart and stared at each other, both of us clearly shocked by what had just happened. The fluorescent lights hummed above us. The city continued sparkling below. And my carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. I should go, Jake said finally. Yes, I agreed, though neither of us moved. When he finally left, I stayed in the conference room for another hour, staring at the marketing materials scattered across the table and trying to convince myself that what had just happened was a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by too much caffeine and too many late nights. But every time I touched my lips, I could still feel the warmth of his mouth against mine, and I knew I was lying to myself. The drive home to David felt longer than usual. I spent the weekend analyzing what had happened with the same methodical approach I used for market research. It was an anomaly, I decided. A momentary lapse brought on by stress and proximity and the flattering attention of an intelligent young man. It wouldn't happen again because I wouldn't let it happen again. I was a professional, a wife, a woman with responsibilities and reputation to maintain. Monday morning, I would establish clear boundaries, keep our interactions strictly business, and pretend that kiss had never occurred. That plan lasted exactly 4 hours. Jake arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, just like every other morning, but something was different. He didn't avoid eye contact or act awkward like I'd expected. Instead, he looked at me with the same steady confidence he'd shown since his first day, as if kissing his boss was just another item on his daily agenda that he'd handled with typical efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with his usual morning coffee. "I've been thinking about the Henley presentation." For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined Friday night entirely. Maybe the stress of managing a major client while training my nephew had finally gotten to me. Maybe I'd projected my own loneliness onto an innocent working relationship and convinced myself something had happened when nothing actually had. Then Jake smiled, and I knew I hadn't imagined anything. "I think we should focus on the emotional narrative," he continued, as if we'd been having a perfectly normal business conversation instead of sitting in the aftermath of crossing a line that shouldn't exist. "But we need to be subtle about it. Make them feel like they're making a logical choice while appealing to their deeper concerns." "Manipulation," I said flatly. "Persuasion," he corrected. "There's a difference." We spent the next 2 hours refining the presentation, and I found myself caught between admiration for his strategic thinking and frustration with how easily he seemed to compartmentalize what had happened between us. I kept waiting for him to reference it, to acknowledge the shift in our dynamic, to show some sign that he was as affected as I was. Instead, he maintained perfect professionalism while somehow managing to make every interaction feel charged with unspoken possibility. By Wednesday, I was exhausted from the effort of pretending normalcy. By Thursday, I was angry at myself for caring whether he was affected. By Friday, I was angry at him for making this look so effortless when I could barely focus on anything except the memory of his mouth against mine. "You're distracted," he said during our afternoon review session. We were back in the conference room, the same space where everything had changed a week ago. This time, I'd made sure to keep the table between us, to maintain physical distance even if I couldn't seem to maintain emotional distance. "I have a lot on my mind," I replied, not looking up from the spreadsheet I was pretending to study. "The Morrison renewal?" "Among other things." Jake was quiet for a moment, and when I finally looked up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not the professional confidence he'd worn all week, but something more uncertain, more vulnerable. "Should we talk about what happened?" he asked quietly. Nothing happened. Something definitely happened. The rational part of my brain knew I should shut this down immediately. Deny everything, transfer him to another department, maintain the fiction that I was the same woman I'd been 2 weeks ago. Instead, I found myself saying, "What would you like to talk about?" "I'd like to talk about how I've been thinking about you every day since Friday. How I've been hoping you've been thinking about me too. How I know this is complicated and probably impossible, but I can't seem to care about that as much as I should." His honesty hit me like cold water. Here was the acknowledgement I'd been waiting for, and now that I had it, I didn't know what to do with it. Because thinking about it meant examining feelings I'd been trying to ignore. It meant acknowledging that my marriage had been slowly dying for years. It meant admitting that I was attracted to my nephew in ways that violated every rule I'd ever believed about appropriate behavior. "This can't happen," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I know. I'm married. I know. Your family. Technically. This is insane." "Probably." We stared at each other across the conference table, and I realized that all my logical arguments felt hollow in the face of how he was looking at me. Like I was worth the risk. Like the complications didn't matter as much as whatever this was between us. The smart thing would have been to end the conversation there. To reassert my authority, maintain my boundaries, protect my marriage and my career and my carefully constructed life. Instead, I heard myself asking, "What happens next?" Jake's smile was slow and certain and full of promises I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "I guess we find out." The business trip to Chicago was supposed to be routine. 3 days of client meetings, a presentation to secure the Henley contract, and enough professional distance to help me regain perspective on what had become an increasingly complicated situation. I'd specifically requested that Jake remain in New York to handle other projects, but Margaret had somehow mixed up the travel arrangements, and by the time I discovered the error, it was too late to change our flights. "I can take a later plane," Jake offered when we met at the gate, but something in his voice suggested he didn't really want to. "Don't be ridiculous," I replied, though every rational part of my brain was screaming that I should send him home immediately. "We'll need all hands on deck for this presentation." The flight was delayed by 2 hours due to weather, which meant spending the afternoon in the airport lounge instead of arriving in Chicago with time to prepare separately for tomorrow's meetings. Jake bought us coffee and found a quiet corner table away from the other stranded travelers. For the first hour, we maintained our professional facade, reviewing presentation materials and discussing strategy. But as the afternoon wore on and our flight was delayed again, the conversation gradually shifted from business to personal. When did you know you wanted to go into marketing? Jake asked, closing his laptop and leaning back in his chair. It was a simple question, but something about the way he asked it made me realize that no one had shown genuine curiosity about my career path in years. David certainly hadn't, not since the early days of our marriage when my ambitions were still new enough to be charming rather than threatening to his own sense of success. I was 23, working as an assistant at a small agency. I found myself saying. There was this campaign for a local restaurant that was failing. Everyone said it was hopeless, but I saw something in the owner's story that no one else had noticed. I convinced my boss to let me try a different approach. What happened? The restaurant not only survived, it expanded to 3 locations within 2 years. And I realized that marketing isn't just about selling products, it's about understanding what people really need and showing them how to get it. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That's what you did with the Morrison campaign, isn't it? You didn't just rebrand their services. You helped them understand their own value. The fact that he grasped the deeper significance of my work sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. When was the last time anyone had seen past the surface of my professional achievements to understand what actually drove me? What about you? I asked. Why marketing instead of law like your father, or medicine like your mother? Because I wanted to understand how people make decisions, he said. Not just what they choose, but why they choose it. What drives someone to take a risk, to change their mind, to want something they never thought they needed. The way he looked at me when he said those last words made it clear we weren't talking about consumer behavior anymore. We were talking about us, about the inexplicable pull that had developed between us despite every logical reason it shouldn't exist. Our flight was finally called at 7 p.m., 3 hours later than scheduled. By the time we reached Chicago, it was nearly midnight local time, and the shuttle to our hotel was the last one running. We sat in the back of the mostly empty bus, the city lights blurring past the windows, and I found myself acutely aware of every point where our bodies almost touched, his knee nearly brushing mine when the bus turned a corner, his hand resting on the seat between us, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. The hotel lobby was quiet, just a few business travelers checking in late like us. We'd been booked into rooms on the same floor, which shouldn't have mattered except that it meant walking down the same hallway, stopping at doors only 3 apart, standing in the awkward space of almost goodnight. Tomorrow's going to be a big day, I said, fishing for my key card and trying to sound more casual than I felt. We'll do great, Jake replied. The presentation is solid, and you have a way of commanding a room that's honestly impressive to watch. I looked up at him then, searching his face for any hint of the professional flattery I was used to receiving from colleagues and subordinates. Instead, I saw genuine admiration mixed with something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken despite every warning bell in my head. Jake, I started, though I wasn't sure what I intended to say. I know, he said softly. This is complicated. More than complicated. But not impossible. The hallway was empty except for us, dimly lit by wall sconces that cast soft shadows between the doorways. In the silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every choice that had led us to this moment. The smart decision was obvious. Say goodnight, go into my room, maintain the boundaries that were already stretched far too thin. Instead, I found myself stepping closer. What are we doing? I whispered. I think we're figuring out what we want more than what we should want, he replied. When he kissed me this time, it wasn't the uncertain question our first kiss had been. This was an answer, a decision, an acknowledgement that whatever this was between us had moved beyond the realm of professional mistake into something neither of us seemed capable of controlling. We kissed, and I felt 20 years of careful self-control dissolve in the space of a heartbeat. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless and shaking and more alive than I'd felt in years. Your room or mine? Jake asked, and I realized we'd already crossed the line from which there might be no return. I chose his room, though I'm not sure why that felt like a meaningful distinction when we both knew what it meant. Maybe because walking through his door felt like a conscious choice rather than something that was simply happening to me. Maybe because I needed to believe I still had some control over a situation that felt increasingly beyond my ability to manage rationally. The room was identical to mine, standard business hotel decor, queen bed with white linens, desk by the window overlooking the city. But everything felt different in this space, charged with possibility and weighted with the magnitude of what we were about to do. Jake closed the door behind us, and the soft click of the lock seemed to echo in the silence. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, and I appreciated that he was giving me one last chance to change my mind, to walk away and pretend this had never happened. The honest answer was that I wasn't sure about anything anymore. I wasn't sure when I'd stopped being satisfied with my marriage, wasn't sure when Jake had transformed from my nephew into someone I couldn't stop thinking about, wasn't sure how I'd become the kind of woman who stood in a hotel room contemplating infidelity with a man half my age who also happened to be family. But I was sure about how I felt when he looked at me like I was the most important person in his world. I was sure about the way my pulse quickened whenever he smiled. I was sure that I'd spent the last 3 weeks feeling more alive than I had in the previous 3 years. "No," I said honestly. "I'm not sure about anything. But I'm here anyway." What happened next was inevitable in the way that avalanches are inevitable once the first snow begins to slide. We spent the night together, and in those hours, I discovered parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. Not just the physical awakening, though that was profound enough, but the emotional intimacy of being truly seen by someone who wanted to understand every thought, every fear, every dream I'd buried under years of responsibility and routine. Jake talked to me like my opinions mattered, like my experiences were fascinating rather than just the predictable milestones of a middle-aged woman's life. He listened when I told him about the promotion I'd been passed over for 5 years ago because the company wasn't ready for a woman in that role. He understood when I explained how lonely it had become to be married to someone who saw my success as competition rather than something to celebrate. In return, I learned about his struggle to find his own path while living in the shadow of accomplished parents. I discovered his insecurity about whether he'd earned his opportunities or simply inherited them through family connections. I saw past the confident exterior to the young man who was still figuring out who he wanted to become. We talked until dawn, wrapped in hotel bathrobes and sharing room service coffee, and I felt like I was meeting myself for the first time in years. This version of Laura who laughed easily, who admitted to uncertainties, who allowed herself to want something just because it felt good rather than because it made strategic sense. When morning light finally crept through the hotel room curtains, reality began to reassert itself. We had a presentation in 4 hours. We had professional reputations to maintain. We had a flight back to New York that evening, back to our regular lives where I was Mrs. Mitchell and he was my nephew, and this night would have to become just a memory. "What happens now?" Jake asked, echoing my own question from a week ago. I wanted to tell him that everything would change, that I would find the courage to restructure my entire life around this new understanding of what happiness could feel like. I wanted to promise that we would find a way to make this work despite every obstacle standing in our way. Instead, I found myself falling back into the protective patterns of a woman who had spent decades learning how to manage risk. "Now we get ready for the presentation," I said, reaching for my clothes. "And we do our jobs." I saw the disappointment flash across his face before he managed to hide it behind his professional mask. But he nodded and began gathering his own clothes, and we both pretended that retreating into familiar roles would somehow make the last 8 hours less significant than they had been. The presentation went flawlessly. We secured the Henley contract with terms even better than we'd hoped for. Jake's insights about emotional marketing proved to be exactly what the client needed to hear, and I found myself genuinely proud of his contribution to our success. For 2 hours, we were the perfect professional team, polished and effective and completely in sync. But underneath the surface performance, I was acutely aware of every glance, every accidental touch, every moment when our professional chemistry hinted at the personal connection we were both trying to ignore. The client complimented our collaboration, said we made an impressive partnership, and I had to work not to blush at words that felt far more revealing than they were intended to be. The flight home was torture. 3 hours of sitting inches apart while pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted between us. Jake buried himself in his laptop, and I stared out the window at clouds that looked like the scattered pieces of thoughts I couldn't quite organize into coherent plans. By the time we landed at JFK, I had almost convinced myself that I could compartmentalize what had happened. It was one night, one mistake, one lapse in judgment that didn't have to define anything about my future choices. I was a strong woman who had simply been caught in a moment of vulnerability. I could learn from it and move forward. That resolution lasted until I walked through my front door and saw David in the kitchen, reading the newspaper with the same bored expression he'd worn for the last 5 years of our marriage. "How was Chicago?" David asked without looking up from his paper, and I realized that in 24 hours, he hadn't even bothered to text me to ask how the presentation went. "Fine," I replied, hanging my coat in the closet and trying to process the strange disconnection I felt between this familiar domestic scene and the intensity of what I'd experienced the night before. "We got the contract." "Good for you." That was it. No follow-up questions about the biggest client win of my career, no interest in the details of a presentation I'd been preparing for weeks, no acknowledgement that this success would significantly impact both our financial future and my professional standing. David turned the page of his newspaper and took another sip of his coffee, and I stood in my own kitchen feeling like a stranger in my own life. I went upstairs to unpack and found myself moving through the motions mechanically, folding clothes and organizing toiletries while my mind replayed fragments of the previous night. The sound of Jake's laugh when I told him about my first disastrous client presentation. The way he'd listened when I talked about my fears that I'd sacrificed too much personal happiness for professional achievement. The certainty in his voice when he told me I deserved better than settling for a marriage that had become merely functional. The contrast between those conversations and the exchange I'd just had with my husband was so stark it made my chest ache. When had David and I stopped being curious about each other's lives? When had we become roommates who shared a mortgage and holiday traditions but no real intimacy or connection? Monday morning arrived with the weight of unspoken expectations. I spent an extra 20 minutes on my appearance, choosing a blue dress that Jake had once complimented, then immediately changed into something more conservative, angry at myself for caring what he thought. The elevator ride to the 46th floor felt endless, and I found myself both hoping and dreading that he would be waiting at his desk when I arrived. He was there, looking perfectly professional in a crisp white shirt and navy tie, reviewing reports like it was any other Monday morning. When I walked past his cubicle, he looked up and smiled with exactly the same friendly professionalism he'd shown every day for the past month. No lingering looks, no meaningful glances, no acknowledgement that anything significant had changed between us. I should have been relieved. This was exactly what needed to happen, a return to appropriate boundaries, a restoration of our professional relationship, a mutual agreement to pretend that Chicago had never happened. Instead, I felt an irrational surge of disappointment that he seemed to be handling this transition so much more easily than I was. The morning passed in a blur of emails and meetings, and I threw myself into work with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts. By lunch, I had reorganized my entire project timeline, reviewed 3 proposals that didn't need immediate attention, and scheduled follow-up calls with clients who weren't expecting to hear from me for another week. Margaret knocked on my office door around 2 o'clock with a concerned expression I'd rarely seen in our 10 years of working together. Laura, are you feeling all right? You seem a bit intense today. I'm fine, I replied quickly. Just trying to stay ahead of things. You've been ahead of things for 20 years. Maybe take a breather? After she left, I sat back in my chair and forced myself to acknowledge what I was really doing. I was trying to exhaust myself enough that I wouldn't have the mental energy to think about Jake, to analyze what had happened between us, to confront the growing realization that one night with him had shown me everything that was missing from my marriage. But the strategy wasn't working. If anything, the harder I tried not to think about him, the more present he became in my thoughts. I found myself listening for his voice in the hallway, glancing toward his cubicle when I walked to meetings, remembering the way he'd looked at me when he said I deserved better. The breaking point came on Wednesday when Jake knocked on my office door with the quarterly reports I'd requested. He was perfectly polite, perfectly professional, and perfectly distant. He placed the files on my desk, confirmed the timeline for the Morrison renewal presentation, and turned to leave without any of the easy conversation that had characterized our working relationship for weeks. Jake, I called out before he reached the door. He turned back, eyebrows raised in polite inquiry, and I realized I had no idea what I wanted to say. That I couldn't stop thinking about Chicago? That I was questioning 20 years of marriage because of one night with him? That I was terrified by how much I wanted to do it again? Thank you for the reports, I said instead. Of course, Ms. Mitchell. The formal address felt like a slap. After everything we'd shared, after the intimacy and honesty and connection, we were back to Ms. Mitchell and professional courtesy and pretending that we were nothing more than supervisor and intern. That evening, I drove home through traffic that seemed heavier than usual, past familiar landmarks that felt somehow different, as if the landscape of my daily routine had shifted in subtle ways I was only beginning to recognize. David was already home, watching television and eating takeout from the containers, and when he asked about my day with the same perfunctory interest he'd shown for years, I found myself wondering if this was really all there was. If this careful, comfortable, utterly predictable existence was what I'd worked so hard to build and protect. And if it was, why did it suddenly feel like a prison rather than a home? The breaking point came on Friday afternoon when Jake submitted his 2-week notice. Margaret delivered the resignation letter with the same neutral efficiency she brought to all administrative tasks, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes as she placed the envelope on my desk. Jake had been one of our most promising interns, and his sudden departure would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give. I stared at the letter for a full minute before opening it, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the single page of corporate letterhead. The language was formal, professional, completely appropriate. He cited new opportunities and expressed gratitude for the learning experience. There was nothing in those carefully chosen words that suggested any personal motivation, nothing that hinted at the complicated history between us. But I knew better. I knew this was his solution to a problem we'd both been trying to ignore for the past week. By removing himself from the equation, he was making the choice I'd been too cowardly to make myself. He was protecting both of us from the inevitable complications of continuing to work together after what had happened in Chicago. The rational part of my brain recognized this as the smart decision. Jake leaving would restore the professional boundaries we'd crossed, eliminate the daily temptation of seeing him, and allow me to focus on repairing whatever was left of my marriage. It was clean, efficient, and completely logical. So why did I feel like I was suffocating? I made it through the rest of the afternoon by sheer force of will, attending meetings and returning phone calls while a part of me screamed that I was about to lose something irreplaceable. By 5 o'clock, most of the office had emptied out for the weekend, and I found myself walking toward Jake's cubicle with no clear plan beyond the desperate need to understand why he was doing this. He was packing up his personal items, a coffee mug, a few books, a small plant his mother had given him for his first day. The sight of him carefully wrapping his belongings in newspaper felt like watching someone dismantle my entire understanding of what my life could be. "Is this because of Chicago?" I asked without preamble. Jake looked up from the box he was filling, and for the first time all week, I saw past his professional mask to the uncertainty underneath. "This is because staying would be a mistake for both of us," he said quietly. "You don't get to make that decision for me." "Don't I?" "You've spent the last week pretending nothing happened. You've been polite and distant and perfectly professional, and I've been trying to follow your lead. But I can't do it anymore, Laura. I can't sit in meetings with you and pretend I don't remember what you look like when you laugh. I can't watch you go home to your husband every night and act like it doesn't kill me a little each time." The honesty in his voice cut through every defense I'd been building since we returned from Chicago. This wasn't just about protecting our professional relationship or avoiding scandal. This was about two people who had discovered something real and profound and completely impossible to sustain within the constraints of our existing lives. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Morrison Industries made me an offer. It's a good position, better than anything I could expect as an intern. Ironic, isn't it? The client we landed together is giving me my exit strategy. Morrison Industries. The account that had brought us together, that had created the foundation for our professional partnership and personal connection. Now it would be the thing that separated us permanently." "Jake, I started, then stopped because I didn't know how to finish that sentence. What could I say? That I was sorry? That I wished things were different? That in one night he'd shown me possibilities I'd never imagined and now I didn't know how to go back to accepting less?" "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "I understand the position you're in. I understand that what we want isn't always what we can have." The mature wisdom in his voice reminded me of our age difference in a way that felt both sobering and irrelevant. Yes, he was 26 to my 47. Yes, he was my nephew. Yes, I was married to a man who, despite our problems, had never actually wronged me in any definitive way. All of these facts should have made my choice obvious. But none of them changed how I felt when Jake looked at me like I was worth fighting for. "I need to finish packing," he said, turning back to his desk. "Margaret has the details about transitioning my projects." I wanted to tell him to stop, to put everything back, to find another solution that didn't involve him disappearing from my life entirely. Instead, I watched him fold his business cards into a neat stack and place them in the box next to his coffee mug. "Will I see you at Christmas?" I asked, grasping for some assurance that this wasn't goodbye forever. "I don't know. Maybe it would be better if we took a break from family gatherings for a while." The idea of holiday dinners without him, of returning to the predictable routine of family obligations where I would sit next to David and make polite conversation about work and weather while remembering what it felt like to be truly understood by someone, filled me with a panic I couldn't quite explain. That night, I sat in my kitchen nursing a glass of wine while David worked late at the office, or claimed to be working late, I was no longer sure which. The house felt larger than usual, echoing with the sound of my own thoughts and the growing realization that I was about to let the best thing that had happened to me in years walk away without a fight. But what kind of fight could I offer? What future could I promise that wouldn't require both of us to sacrifice everything we'd worked to build? The questions followed me to bed, where I lay awake staring at the ceiling and wondering when I'd become the kind of person who chose safety over happiness, obligation over love. The email arrived at 6:30 Monday morning, just as I was leaving for the office. David's assistant had sent it to both of us, a formal notification that David's law firm was representing Morrison Industries in a potential acquisition deal. The same Morrison Industries where Jake would be starting his new position in exactly 1 week. My hands shook as I read the details. Corporate restructuring. Due diligence. extended timeline that would require close collaboration between our companies. David would be spending significant time at Morrison's offices, reviewing their contracts and partnerships, including their recent marketing agreements, including the campaign Jake and I had developed together. The one with both our names on it. I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the office, I drove aimlessly through the city, trying to process the implications of this cosmic joke. In a metropolis of 8 million people, with thousands of law firms and corporations, somehow my husband's firm had been hired to work with the one company that represented both my greatest professional triumph and my most devastating personal complication. David would review our marketing strategy. He would see Jake's contributions, his innovative approaches, the collaborative dynamic that had made our campaign so successful. And David was smart enough, observant enough, to notice things that others might miss. The timing of Jake's hire. The personal investment we'd both shown in the project. The way our professional partnership had elevated both our performances beyond what either of us had achieved independently. By noon, I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from Morrison's headquarters, staring at my phone and trying to decide whether to warn Jake or pretend I didn't know what was coming. The rational choice was obvious: stay out of it, let events unfold naturally, trust that 2 intelligent professionals could navigate a business relationship without revealing personal history that had no bearing on corporate transactions. But rationality had stopped being my strong suit somewhere around the time I'd started falling for my nephew. I was still debating when my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my stomach drop even before I answered. "Laura, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." The tone of his voice was different from any I'd heard in years of marriage. Not angry, exactly, but focused in a way that reminded me why he'd built his reputation as one of the city's most effective attorneys. This wasn't my distracted husband asking about dinner plans. This was a lawyer who'd discovered something that required investigation. "What is it?" I managed. "I'm looking at the Morrison marketing files, and I keep seeing references to collaboration between you and an intern named Jake Mitchell." "Mitchell is your maiden name, isn't it?" My heart stopped. In all my panic about David working with Morrison Industries, I'd somehow overlooked the most obvious danger. Jake had been hired under his full name, and in the corporate world where networking and family connections were standard practice, no one had thought to disguise the relationship between us. "He's my nephew," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My sister's son. I helped him get the internship." "I see. And this intern contributed significantly to a $50 million campaign?" "He's very talented. MBA from Wharton, top of his class. Talented enough that Morrison specifically requested him for their team. Talented enough that they're paying him a starting salary most people don't see until they're 30. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, could picture David in his office with files spread across his desk, building his case the way he'd done in countless depositions and negotiations. "I'm proud of his success," I said carefully. "Are you?" "Because I'm looking at travel records here, and it appears you and Jake were both in Chicago on the same dates last month. Same hotel, actually. Rooms on the same floor." The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too full of people who might overhear a conversation that was about to destroy my life. I stood up and walked outside, my legs unsteady as I found a bench in a small park across the street. "David, I can explain." "Can you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my wife used her position to advance her nephew's career, then took him on what appears to be a romantic getaway disguised as a business trip. And now he's landed a job with one of our biggest clients, which puts me in a rather awkward professional position." The clinical way he described it made everything sound sordid and calculated, like I'd orchestrated some elaborate scheme for personal gain. But underneath his lawyer's precision, I could hear something else, not jealousy or hurt, but inconvenience. He was annoyed that my personal choices had created professional complications for him. It wasn't like that, I said, though I wasn't sure how to explain what it had actually been like. Then tell me what it was like, Laura. Because I have a meeting with Morrison's executive team in 2 hours, and I need to know if there's anything else I should be aware of before I walk into that room. The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready to face. This was my chance to confess everything, to clear the air and deal with the consequences honestly. It was also my chance to deny everything, to minimize and deflect and hope that David's corporate concerns would override any personal suspicions. But as I sat on that bench, watching strangers walk past with their own secrets and complications, I realized that the choice wasn't just about what to tell David. It was about who I wanted to be going forward. "There's nothing else you need to know for your meeting," I said finally. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "I see," David said eventually. "Well, then I suppose we'll all just have to navigate this professionally." After he hung up, I sat in the park for another hour, watching office workers hurry past on their lunch breaks and wondering if any of them had ever felt as simultaneously terrified and relieved as I did in that moment. The dinner reservation was for 7 o'clock at the same restaurant where David had proposed 23 years ago. I knew this because he'd told me when he called that afternoon, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that meant he'd made a decision about something important. "We needed to talk," he'd said, "and it would be better to do it somewhere private but public enough to keep us both civilized." I spent 2 hours getting ready, trying on 3 different dresses before settling on the blue one that Jake had once complimented. Then I changed into black, then back to blue, angry at myself for caring what I looked like for a conversation that would probably end my marriage. The restaurant was exactly as I remembered it, dim lighting, white tablecloths, the kind of studied elegance that suggested special occasions and serious conversations. David was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a bottle of wine already open. He stood when he saw me, pulled out my chair, and waited until I was seated before pouring me a glass of the Bordeaux we'd shared on our wedding night. "You look beautiful," he said, and I could hear the genuine affection in his voice along with something that sounded like sadness. "Thank you." We made small talk through the appetizer course, work, the weather, plans for the upcoming holidays. David asked about my Morrison campaign, and I found myself describing Jake's contributions with the professional pride I'd always felt when discussing successful projects. If David noticed how often Jake's name came up in my explanation, he didn't comment. It wasn't until the main courses arrived that he finally addressed what we were both thinking about. "I know about the affair, Laura." The words landed with surprising gentleness, like he was sharing information rather than making an accusation. I set down my fork and looked across the table at the man I'd been married to for 2 decades, searching his face for anger or hurt or betrayal. Instead, I saw something I hadn't expected: relief. "How long have you known?" I asked. "I suspected after Chicago. The way you came home, the way you've been different these past few weeks. But I didn't know for certain until today when I was reviewing the Morrison files. Hotel records, travel expenses, the timeline of Jake's job offer, it wasn't hard to piece together. I waited for the anger, the accusations, the emotional explosion that should have followed such a revelation. Instead, David took a sip of wine and continued in the same measured tone he might use to discuss a client's case. "The irony is that I probably wouldn't have looked so closely if you hadn't seemed so happy." "Happy? You've been different since Chicago. More present, more engaged. You smile when you think no one's looking. For the first time in years, you seem like you actually enjoy your life instead of just enduring it." The observation hit me harder than any accusation could have. Had I really been that transparent? Had my contentment been so obvious that even my distracted husband had noticed it? "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. "Are you?" "Because I'm not sure I am." I looked up sharply, startled by the unexpected response. "Laura, we've been going through the motions of this marriage for years. We're polite to each other, we attend social functions together, we share household responsibilities and financial planning, but when was the last time we actually enjoyed each other's company? When was the last time we had a conversation about something that mattered to either of us?" The honesty in his voice forced me to confront what I'd been avoiding for months. Our marriage hadn't failed because of Chicago. Chicago had happened because our marriage had already failed, slowly and quietly and without either of us acknowledging it. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" I asked. "I'm saying I think we both deserve better than what we've settled for." David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it on the table between us with the careful precision of someone who'd spent considerable time preparing for this moment. "I've been thinking about this for longer than you might expect," he said. "Not the infidelity, I didn't know about that until today. But the state of our marriage, the direction our lives have taken, whether we're still the people we were when we made those promises to each other 23 years ago." I stared at the envelope, understanding without opening it what it contained. Legal documents. Divorce papers. The formal dissolution of a union that had been dissolving informally for years. "There's someone else, isn't there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Her name is Rebecca. She's an associate at the firm. It's been going on for about 6 months. 6 months. While I'd been questioning my marriage and feeling guilty about my attraction to Jake, David had been building a relationship with someone else. The symmetry would have been funny if it hadn't been so tragic. "Do you love her?" I asked. "I think I might. But more importantly, I remember what it feels like to look forward to seeing someone, to be excited about sharing my day with them, to feel like my life is expanding instead of contracting." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the magnitude of what we were acknowledging. 23 years of marriage, of shared experiences and accumulated history and intertwined finances and social connections, reduced to a conversation over dinner and a manila envelope on a white tablecloth. "What happens now?" I asked finally. "Now we figure out how to untangle our lives with as much dignity and kindness as we can manage. The papers are already drawn up, generous settlement, no contest, we split everything equitably and move forward." I picked up the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, I looked across the table at David, really looked at him for the first time in years, and saw not the husband who'd disappointed me or the obstacle to my happiness, but a man who was also trying to figure out how to build a life that felt authentic and meaningful. "For what it's worth," he said as we prepared to leave, "I hope things work out with Jake. He seems like a good kid, and you deserve someone who makes you smile the way you've been smiling lately." As I drove home through the city lights, past the familiar landmarks that would soon become part of my former life rather than my current one, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with Jake. About the choice between the safe, predictable future I'd always planned and the uncertain, complicated possibility he represented. The phone was ringing when I walked through the door. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in weeks, I answered without hesitation. "I heard about the divorce," he said without preamble. "Morrison's legal team mentioned it during orientation today. Word travels fast in corporate circles. Are you okay?" I looked around the house that had been my home for 15 years, at the furniture we'd chosen together and the photographs of vacations that had stopped being fun years ago, and realized that for the first time since Chicago, I could answer that question honestly. "I think I'm going to be better than okay," I said. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to find out what that looked like.